Find out what's on TJC. Sign up for our bi-weekly email program guide at tjctv.com.
Welcome to the Salon. On this episode, trying to make sense of the Gabrielle Giffords shooting, debating the newest battle in the mommy wars, former Israeli President Moshe Katsav's rape conviction, do we really need a Jewish Miss America, and more. It's coming up on the Salon.
Hello, I'm Jane Eisner, editor of The Forward and Forward.com. Welcome to the Salon.
And I'm Rachel Sklar from Mediaite.com.
Rachel, we have a wonderful group of women with us today. Joining us is Lizzie Skurnick. She is a columnist for Politics Daily and the Daily Beast, writes about books for NPR, and is the author of Shelf Discovery, the teen classics we never stopped reading. Also, Blu Greenberg, the founder of the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance and the author of On Women and Judaism and many other books. And joining us again is Lilit Marcus, who's editor-in-chief of thegloss.com and author of Save the Assistants, A Guide to Surviving and Thriving in the Workplace. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us. Rachel, we recently lost an amazing voice in the Jewish world, Debbie Friedman, who died way too soon at age 59. Did you grow up with her music?
You know, it's funny, I actually was only recently exposed to her music, but I was in like an incredible revelation. She basically took the, background, muted, Passover history of woman that was never in the Haggadah and brought it front and center with her songs about, Miriam and celebrating women in Jewish life and in Jewish lore. And I saw her perform and lead a Seder at the JCC a few years ago, and it was just a revelation. All these women getting up and dancing to her music. It was really a powerful experience, and it was a very jarring loss, a sad loss.
I found myself just humming her songs all throughout the week. I'm also very fond of that Miriam song, in part because I have a Miriam, and her bat mitzvah was actually Bashalach, the time in the Torah portion when Miriam leads the women in song, and so we've always sung that song then, and we always sing it at the Seder, and we sang it last Friday night just because we wanted to. But, she was really a product of the reform movement. Blu, did you feel that she had power that extended beyond just the reform world?
Way beyond. She was really an angel and religious bard for the entire community, and she impacted very heavily on conservative movement and on the Orthodox community as well. And she's irreplaceable. She just touched millions of people's souls, and she had a way of doing this in their joy and in their sadness. She's an incredible human being and spirit.
Well, thank you. Of course, the news has also been very troubling. Recently, we saw the attempted assassination of Gabrielle Giffords, the congresswoman from Arizona, and there's been a lot of discussion about the motivation of the alleged shooter, whether it should be placed into a political context or concern about mental health, or whether or not, as some people have said, we should just consider this person to be, a lone evil gunman. What do you think, Lizzie?
What I found interesting is that when the debate sort of rose up about beginning to talk about how uncivil the discourse was in the country, it's something that I think the Democrats and liberals have actually been sort of hesitant to take head on. And so I think actually it's not that whether he's mentally ill or whether he was driven by, Sarah Palin, but I think everybody found that this was an opportunity to actually begin to object to the kind of discourse that, Sarah Palin and Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck have brought to the table.
President Obama said that if we are going to react in that way, that we have to do it in a fashion that's worthy of the victims, of those who were injured, as the congresswoman was, but also the ones who lost their lives. Do you think we're capable of doing that, Lilit?
I hope so. I hope that what this teaches us is that as a country we deserve to have a political discourse that isn't about name-calling or finger-pointing or victim-blaming. It's about truly discussing ideas. And I hope that this teaches us as a country that we're capable of doing that.
But I think that there will always be, angry rhetoric, inflammatory rhetoric. I mean, that's not new. I think what felt new in this case was that there was a direct correlation, not between the shooter's actions, but the fact that there had been an actual violent, depiction, i.e. the gun sights over specific districts, including Gabrielle Giffords' district, and that she herself had made the connection saying that this is a bridge too far, and there are consequences. So it was not just like an opportunity for liberals to like beat on Sarah Palin here. This was a realization like, oh my God, someone actually shot her, and there were gun sights over her district. Could there be a connection? And whether or not there was a connection in this case, like, should we be nervous? Because it isn't an isolated incident in the sense, like, there have been links with, like, sort of, like, extremist viewpoints, angry political rhetoric, and people actually doing crazy things. And so, in that respect, I think that the call is not to abridge speech, but to encourage people who would be our leaders to lead responsibly.
I also just think it's thug-like. I mean, it's intellectually embarrassing. It's fine, if you go to Parliament. I mean, there's plenty of places where people use inflammatory rhetoric, but this is just stupid. I mean, it's stupid to yell, "You lie," at the president. Find something more intelligent to say. I mean, if Sarah Palin read a book and was periodically clever about something, I think, the fact, if she could do it ironically or do it with some wit or do it with some feeling, but I really just feel like, I want to send her back to 7th grade and have her, read a history book and then do whatever you want. I just feel embarrassed at other countries looking at us that this is our level of rhetoric, this is our level of discourse.
It was fascinating after the famous video that she released in which she said that the criticism of the conservatives was akin to a blood libel, that we found people actually debating whether or not she even knew what that meant.
Yeah.
Well, I think she used it correctly, because I certainly don't agree with Sarah Palin, but she understood what blood libel is, and that is that somebody makes an accusation and tries to destroy you completely, which is what I think her opponents are trying to use the connection, the crosshairs reference, to destroy her politically, and in a sense trying to do the same thing of which they are accusing her. So I'm not a supporter of Sarah Palin by any means, but Jews don't own the term blood libel, unfortunately. And
but do you think she knew the source? I mean,
she understood very well what it meant.
Well, someone did. Whether she wrote it for herself, I think, is somewhat debatable.
Well, the truth is, our tradition teaches us that we own our words, right? We have to be responsible for them, and so if those words were accurate, then she should own up to them, and if they were offensive, she should own up to that too.
And if you're going to use loaded words.
Avoid blood. Like, here's who had blood, the lady who got shot in the head. When they bring up the Washington Times used pogrom, it's just, when someone's murdered, that's not the time for you to say, someone has been using, just don't use the word blood at all unless someone shot you too.
Good advice.
I think Obama's point about not making political capital out of this now and watching, it's really, the entire community is indicted to watch our language and not be excessive and incendiary in our language. And we're all, I have to say, guilty of that.
Oh, we are.
But I think it actually, what this should bring us to focus on is what do parents do, or what does a community do when one in their midst is mentally imbalanced and has access to guns, and there's somebody who could have been more responsible in preventing this.
Well, clearly people knew about him. I mean, clearly everybody knew that this was an unbalanced person, and I was confused about that, about the story that, because I'm a teacher, and I do have, people to send any student that is exhibiting problems towards, and I just felt like maybe did someone not take responsibility? Did anybody not care? And that was confusing to me. Does Arizona have a weak social network for mental health?
Well, I don't think it's limited to Arizona. Unfortunately, in our country, we just don't have the means to deal with, especially once someone is an adult and once they're reasonably competent taking care of themselves every day. There are so few options for family members to deal with a mentally ill relative if the relative doesn't want to be dealt with. And I think that's a much bigger problem in our culture, is when do we say these people have agency and when do we say they don't? And unfortunately, I don't think there's the time or money to really, deal with every single person who has mental illness.
And unfortunately, prevention is a tricky, for me, it's always seemed just incredible to me that it seems like the simplest way to get at this is to just make guns harder to get.
Well, also the type of gun he used. I mean, there's plenty of I'm not a gun owner. I have no need of guns. But, plenty of my friends in the South own guns, many of them. And I think
it's a religion.
Fine. Yeah, they carry a gun around. It's weird. But, but they're not guns that you could kill. They're not guns for killing. Guns for killing people are nothing citizens should be able to buy.
Well,
I think anyone should agree. If everyone had to have a rifle.
Well, maybe Gabrielle Giffords will be the person. Maybe she'll be the one who moves gun legislation forward.
So now let's look at a different issue where some people think there has been an important change, and that is in the conviction on sexual assault and rape of former Israeli President Moshe Katsav.
This is a heavy salon today, my goodness.
I know, really. We'll get to
talk
some
about
of the
Real
fun stuff.
Housewives last night.
We'll get to some of the fun stuff later, but this is an interesting question because even though the story itself is obviously so depressing, there were many in Israel who felt, many feminists who felt, that the fact that this man, this very powerful man, had been convicted was an important step for women's rights, indeed for all rights there. What do you think, Lilit?
I completely agree with that. I think it's wonderful that just because you're wealthy, just because you're powerful, just because you have a name. I mean, the women who were pressing the charges were known as Aleph and Lamed. They didn't even use their real names because they, they couldn't even use their real names because they didn't want to come forward. And I think it's wonderful that no matter how powerful you are, you're still subject to the same laws as everybody else. I think that sends a wonderful sign.
Netanyahu made the most, I thought, the most cogent statement. He said, this is a sad day for Israel. He said, but we've learned from this that no one is above the law and that women have control over their own bodies. And I couldn't think, is there any other other official in the Middle East or in probably most democracies around the world who would make that statement?
And yet, that's sort of an obvious statement. It's stunning that 2011, that's revolutionary.
I found something else sort of disturbing about it. I don't know if any of you noticed the depiction of the victims, and this may be slightly a translation problem, but Aleph was consistently, I think the judges called her unsophisticated, natural, this is not a person who's manipulative or whatever, and that, Moshe was, and I was like, well, God forbid you be a manipulative. I guess I can't get raped in Israel and, win the case. And I thought that was...
You're very sophisticated.
very, I'm not guileless. And these were female judges writing this, that this woman is believable because she's so unsophisticated, because she's so guileless. So God forbid you're awkward talking about your rape, or you have a spin you want to put on your rape. You still got raped. And I'm hoping that's really a translation issue and not something that was a serious part of it, because I was a little bit annoyed by that.
I took something quite different from it, which was that they gave him an opportunity for plea bargains, because that's what one does with government officials everywhere around the world, and he refused it. And then they took the testimony, and basically what they were saying was not that they had no choice, but that they were sitting judges on a case where the women had integrity, their testimony was honest, not that they were guileless, but that their testimony was honest, and his was, came out seemingly dishonest.
They never said honest, though, about the women. They never said that they had integrity or honesty. They said again, this is the translation thing. I don't know that they meant unsophisticated. I think they may have just meant, natural, that they didn't seem to be being manipulative. Exactly. Let's hope.
So now there was another Israeli Supreme Court ruling that was a bit more complicated. There are buses that go through ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in which women are assigned to sit in the back, men in the front. In some cases, women must board the buses in the back as well. And the court delivered an interesting ruling on this, saying that, well, this is okay as long as no one is coerced into the seating arrangement.
No, how possibly could a woman feel coerced in that situation?
So, she spat upon, or
And women actually had very different reactions to this too. Some of them expressing your skepticism, Rachel, but others saying, well, but this was also an important ruling because the court said women can't be coerced. What do you make of it, Blu?
To me, it was another statement about the democracy, that Israel is a great democratic state. And I think the court was trying to say that no, buses should not be segregated, but we also want to look at a specific community and respect minority rights, and that the women of this community particularly want, and the women and the men of this community want segregated buses for their religious reasons, and that self-segregation, they didn't say segregation is okay, they said it's forbidden, but self-segregation is okay, and let's revisit this in 1 year just to make sure that self-segregation doesn't turn into coerced segregation.
Well, if that was the only incident of segregation enforced by the law in Israel, I might agree with you, but I can't look at something like the Western Wall and not think that this is evidence of something larger and something scary happening in Israel, where it is legislated that a woman can't use her voice to pray at the wall. What's next? We may say that segregated buses are for one particular community, but that's the community that has more children than any other group in Israel, and I worry that they're going to get an outsized sense of power and that become a larger group.
They already have an outside sense of power.
it also seems just a little bit of like an unfunded mandate to me. It's like, okay, what constitutes coercion? What happens when someone gets coerced? And that's my worry about it. Like, let's say I get on a bus in Israel, which I may do this summer, and I don't feel like, sitting, in the back. What do I get to do if someone coerces me?
They can't coerce you. Then you could take it to the court. You can sit.
That's what I want to do on my vacation.
Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly. Didn't this all come out of a violent altercation as well?
Yes,
They're all very violent.
Right.
That's the problem also. Like, that's what I mean by unfunded mandate. I mean, the women get, shaken and spat on. It's not, it's quite serious.
But I think the difference, if I may, what Blu is pointing out is that now with this court ruling, if that does happen, and there's no way to legislate bad, against all bad behavior. If that does happen, there is the chance to now say, no, you violated the law.
But they're always, here's my problem. You're always violating the law if you spit on someone and assault them. So it's the, what I mean?
Never taken to the court in that situation.
But those men were always violating the law at that. They weren't violating the law by objecting, but anytime they did that, physical assault in Israel is still violating the law.
And here's the other thing, it's always voluntary where you sit. Yeah. Like, the court making a ruling that it's permissible because if a woman can do it, it's totally voluntary, sends the wrong signal. It's always voluntary. If they outlawed segregation on buses, self-selection could still happen. But they flipped it, and they basically implied that it was okay and that they're going to turn a blind eye.
No, I don't think that's so. I think they said if Lizzie wants to go sit in the front of a bus, on a bus that is otherwise segregated, no one can touch her. That's her entitlement now.
We actually assigned a reporter last year to ride the buses and to see what it's like. We assigned a male, our Israel correspondent is a male, and then we found a female correspondent to also ride there too. And actually, what they found was a surprising amount of comedy. I mean, that there just wasn't a lot of tension there, and that this is how people want it to be. I mean, I have to tell you, I was surprised at that story, but I trusted the people who were doing the reporting, and just because I find it, from my own American feminist perspective, hard to understand. And so, but let's also remember, we're not talking about all the buses in Israel.
The South wanted to be segregated too, though.
But I
mean, it's like there's a lot of places.
I find myself supporting this to some degree because I do think that it now needs to be tested. But I was just on a public train in Israel a week and a half ago, and everybody was sitting everywhere. I mean, we're only talking about bus routes that go through certain neighborhoods and from certain neighborhoods.
Well, I grew up in the South, and I think while I wasn't living when there was enforced segregation, it was impossible to ignore the repercussions of those things. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard things about Black people really want to go to different schools and don't want to have to go to school with white people, and the government is making them. And to be honest with you, I have no idea what's in the hearts and minds of the women in those communities. Maybe they really are happy with this decision, maybe they really aren't, but just because people said they wanted segregation doesn't mean that that makes it right.
Well, it's that it shouldn't be the default. I would prefer the ruling to just say the default is that anyone can sit where anyone wants, and that was not the default. The default is, oh, we have to respect this segregation. Well, actually, anyone can sit wherever they want covers both sides, whereas women cannot be coerced. It's like, well, thank you very much. I'm glad I can't be coerced.
I pray in an Orthodox synagogue, and I remember once there was a conference convened by a pluralist group of pluralist Jews and they said, and I'm a feminist, and there are plenty of things that I criticize within my own community, but I recall that feeling was somebody came up with the idea there shouldn't be any Orthodox services allowed at this conference because the Orthodox persecute women. That was very jarring to me. So I think respecting a community in terms of its own beliefs, if it's not harming anybody else, I think we should do that. Otherwise, we're all, pushed into one mold, and that's not liberty and freedom.
So let's move on. As long as we're done for the moment criticizing the way Jews act on buses, how about
just Jewish men hitting and spitting women? Everybody else is fine.
So there's a really interesting story and book that's making the rounds called The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. It's written by Yale Law professor Amy Chua, and in it she argues that Chinese mothers in particular are right to be so exceedingly strict with their children, to have very high expectations. And in making this argument, she specifically is citing the way many people are raised in America as being soft and much more concerned with hurting a child's feeling and a child's sense of self-esteem than actually raising that child to be the very, very best that she or he can be. What do you think about this, Lizzie?
Well, my first reaction to this piece and what my Facebook status update was immediately was, who knew my Jewish dad was a Chinese mother? Like, I had no idea. But, here's the problem. Immediately when you have a piece like that, all everybody starts to do is examine their own, how they were parented and how they parent. And I started doing that too, of course, being like, was it good that I had to practice violence 6 hours a day, la, 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 la. And then all of a sudden I was like, you know what? I feel duped. Like, I'm so tired of hearing about how anybody parents at all, and that this is sort of the equivalent of like the French women don't get fat of parenting, sort of like my cultural way is better than yours. And I just thought it was very wise on the part of the publishers, but just enormously silly.
So, Blu, you've raised quite a few children. Is there a Jewish model of parenting that is either the same or different than this?
Well, I think she talks really not only about Chinese parenting, but really about immigrant parenting in general, right? On the other hand, Jewish immigrant parents, well, first of all, we're a generation removed from the original Jewish immigrant parents. And it's interesting that I think probably the group that was most sensitive to her piece was our Jewish parents, because we do have a different style. My first reaction was, thank God that my mother was pretty strict, but thank God I didn't have Amy Chua as a parent. and I think that there are many different ways to parent children. That certainly would not be my way. And actually, I'm writing a book about my son, and who was killed 8 years ago, and I'm doing a lot of reminiscing about parenting incidents. And I know it sounds a little funny to say, but I appreciate every sort of gentle, tender, even if I can say indulgent moment of that relationship. And so those are some, of the very strong positive memories.
I have to say, when I read the piece, I was also wondering, how must her children feel?
Well, that was the thing about the piece.
She wouldn't care. That's the whole point, right?
I mean, to talk about your children in that way, it really upset me. And I'm not saying
That's
that.
because you're soft.
Yeah, well, I was
guess
about
so,
to say,
but I don't call my girls garbage in print.
But that's the thing, you never know, though. I mean, that's what I find so arrogant about all of these parents, because it's like, yeah. Your kid's not going to be thinking about you when he or she is 23. You know what I mean?
True.
It's sort of true. Well, sorry to break this, on you. But no, you're not. You're thinking about yourself. And there's an extent to which you think about your parents. But I was trained as a violinist and as a classical singer and as all of these things, but I was a writer. I wrote from the time I was 7 and I became a writer. And I'm sure my father's disappointed. I love that I had that training, but it didn't affect what I became.
But my point was a little different. I mean, I do think that there's a kind of statute of limitations on the amount of time parents can be fairly blamed for their children's ills, and all
not
that.
past 7.
but there's another thing that this brings up, which is the question of how we talk about our children in a public and very lasting way. I mean, these statements that this person has made, just like the statements so many people, I think, unfortunately make about their family members, are there. They're making the rounds, they're viral, they're in print. And what kind of effect especially does that have on children who at some point are going to be reading this?
But they're not.
They're used to her, right? I mean,
they're not going to read it.
But this is just another, everybody has their own. It's what Lizzie says. This is the way she does things. This is how she runs her life. She's clearly very focused on herself, right? I mean, that the first thing you look at when a parent or a family member reveals things that are damaging or maybe selfish with their family experiences, you say, okay, I know where that person was coming from for this. All you can do is sort of take it all in, and then when it's your turn to make those decisions, make the best decisions you can. 99.9% of the parents that I know, that's all they ever did. They do what they can, they do the best they can, they just, every day, they try and be loving and supportive and make stuff happen. And everybody has their own version of how that's best done.
Yeah, I think the parenting in public thing is a really interesting question, and I see it on a level every day. My friends who have children post about their children online. They have blogs about them, or they post pictures of their kids on Facebook. And I'm really curious to see how the next generation is going to be affected by the fact that when you were 3 weeks old, your parents posted naked pictures of you on Facebook. And it may not seem like anything now, but how long will the parents keep doing that? How long will they blog about their children? I remember reading an Anne Lamott story about her 15-year-old son asking him not to write about him anymore. And she wrote about him asking her not to write about him.
Oh, gosh.
Well, that's a really good point about confidentiality, respecting children's confidentiality, as much as writers have to respect their parents' confidentiality. And I think that her children are going to be interviewed up the gazoo for the next, period of time. But I got a feeling reading that article, I don't know what I read in between the lines, that her children were basically quite happy with their childhood.
Yeah.
And my children had a totally different upbringing, and hopefully they're happy with their childhood.
Well, also, I come from the book world, so I have tons of friends whose parents wrote about them, wrote poems about them, learning to pee, wrote memoirs. And you know what? Some of my novelist friends are always like, but I don't want to write a sex scene because my kid's going to read it. And it's like, your kid doesn't care about your book. Your kid is going to be doing something else. You may have a child who's obsessed with you.
Well, it depends how old they are, when the sex scene's written, does everybody come to school with that?
People are concerned with themselves.
But I just think that
you can depend on it.
Things seem really big to you when you're any age that are happening to you, and the more public it is, the more there is to deal with. But Facebook may actually help people sort of slough this off and be like, whatever, there'll be another mother book next week. Because there will be.
Yeah, no one's ever gone broke underestimating women's desire to criticize themselves.
Right.
And unfortunately, Amy Chua is a very successful woman. She's a Yale law professor, and she's not writing a big deal article in the New York Times about the law. And the fact that we're all still talking about this story and that there have been so many responses and that the story keeps growing and has a life of its own, I think is really telling, and that the mommy wars are never going to be over.
Well, but that's why it seems like link bait to me. That's the part that bothers me about it. It's basically like me saying,
I think women are most attractive when they wear blue and not gray. Like, it's crazy.
How dare you?
How dare you? And then we have to argue, you know, it's just incendiary. It's like silly. So on that note, keep that in mind. One last thing we must talk about, Miss America. We had a chance, a 1 in 50 chance of having another Jewish Miss America. The last one was Bess Meyerson in 1949. But Lauren Galler-Rabinowitz, sadly, though she was a Harvard graduate, did not quite make it even until the finals. I confess, I watched it. I watched some of it to find out where she was and found it sort of oddly addicting. You know, is this crazy, Lily? Should we still be even caring about Miss America and primetime television?
It's a good question. I'm of two minds about it. I think as a feminist, I sort of naturally eschew anything having to do with beauty contests, but I can't underestimate the power of a small community feeling like it's being represented in a mainstream way. Both of my parents are hearing impaired, and when I grew up, I remember when Heather Whitestone, who was deaf, won Miss America. And no, the thing that I don't want every little deaf girl in America to aspire to is to be a beauty queen, but you could not imagine the effect that it had on the deaf community, which is already small and feels underrepresented, to get someone like that on a national stage who represents them. I think that was so important.
Well, I guess we're going to have to wait for at least another year.
We got Natalie Portman. Like, we got nothing to complain about.
No, she's out of commission right now.
No, she won the Golden Globe. She's, you know, she's
going to be writing a parenting book.
Well,
On
that note, I'm afraid it's time for us to wrap up this wonderful edition of the Salon. I do want to thank Lizzie Skurnick, Blu Greenberg, and Lilit Marcus for joining us today. This was a good talk, don't you think so, Rachel?
It was very deep. I think it might have been our deepest salon yet.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jane Eisner, editor of ForwardandForward.com. Continue the conversation on our Sisterhood blog. For everyone here at the Salon, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.